I'm Tom, coming to you from the International Institute for the Advancement of Sourdough Science and Research of Cleveland, Ohio, also known as my kitchen. Thank you for selecting this video. Now, I've been making these instructional videos for about 2 years now, and some of the feedback that I often get on my videos is people say, Tom, your videos are great, but they're really long. Can you just create a shorter version where you summarize all the details in one place? So I'm going to attempt to do that today. We'll see if I can. But before I do that, I also want to give you some tips on how to watch my longer videos. The reason my videos are long is because I'm doing scientifically repeatable experiments where I show every step in the process that produces the outcome of the loaves at the end of the process. I'm the only person on YouTube who does the videos with this level of scientific rigor. So the purpose of this is because you could replicate the exact same results at home by watching these videos. Now, what I've done recently is I've added chapter breaks to all my videos. So a quick way to watch these is watch the introduction to the video to find out what it's about, then fast forward to the end and go to the chapter called Comparison of Loaves, where I recap the experiment, then I cut the loaves open and describe what the outcome is. And then if you're really interested in seeing all the steps in between, it's all there if you want to go back and watch the details. But for today's video, I'm going to try to reduce down as best as I can all the key things that I've learned over the last 2 years of these experiments. So today's video is called The 10 Secrets of Sourdough Success. One of the biggest challenges with sourdough baking is that there is a very high failure rate. And what happens is a lot of new sourdough bakers, they'll spend a couple weeks building a sourdough starter, and they'll go on the internet and find some random sourdough recipe. They follow the steps of the recipe just like they do for any other recipe that they followed in the past, and they make a brick. Then they think that there was something wrong with the recipe, so they go find another recipe, they try that one, they fail again, they fail again. Occasionally they'll have a loaf that works and they don't really know why. But the biggest problem is that people think sourdough baking is similar to other cooking where you basically follow the steps of the recipe. Sourdough baking is different because it's a process. The recipes are all fairly similar. Flour, water, salt, sourdough starter, that's all that goes into it. But the process for how you create sourdough bread is very complex and very different from other cooking or baking. For example, I have Mark Bittman's book. This has 1,000 recipes in it. None of these recipes give you any of the techniques required for making sourdough bread other than how to mix ingredients and how to put something into the oven. Because when you're making sourdough bread, you're basically doing a fermentation process. This is a biological process that normally would happen in a laboratory, and you're doing it in the kitchen. And what you can see is from the time you add your starter to the flour and water until you bake the loaf, you have a living biological organism on your countertop. This is what makes sourdough baking different. So learning the art of sourdough baking is really learning about fermentation, and it's about unlearning a lot of the things that you've learned in the past from traditional cooking in the kitchen. So the first thing you want to do with sourdough baking is pick a reliable, proven recipe that also describes the process in detail, not just the list of ingredients and a few steps. I strongly recommend Chad Robertson's Tartine Bread. This is one of the best sourdough baking books out there. The description of how to make the basic country loaf, that's his standard recipe, is 65 pages long, because making sourdough isn't the recipe, it's the process. It's really learning these steps. And when you're making sourdough bread, it involves a lot of different sciences. It involves biology to create your starter and to do the fermentation. It involves chemistry when you create the gluten by mixing flour and water. It involves physics when you're basically moving the dough and creating that kinetic energy within the dough that creates the layers of gluten within your dough. It involves architecture where you're folding the dough in a way to create a tall loaf. And it involves thermodynamics when you're trying to figure out how to best bake your loaf to get the ultimate oven spring and open crumb in your oven. In addition to the 5 sciences, the other thing that's unique about sourdough baking is it requires you to use all 5 senses: sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell. You have to use all these things to get the feel for your dough, to understand what your dough should smell like when bulk fermentation is done, what your dough should look like. So this is a complex set of skills that you have to develop. So my first recommendation is pick one recipe and stick with it until you master a basic sourdough loaf. Because what you're really learning is the process. It's not about the ingredients. It's not about trying different recipes. This is just like in that movie, The Karate Kid, where that young kid goes to the master to learn karate. And in the first few weeks, the guy just has him doing chores around the house, waxing his car, wax on, wax off, painting the fence, painting the house. And after a while, the kid realizes that these are the basic skills that are needed for karate. And then it all comes together because he's doing it second nature. That's exactly what you need to do with this process. By baking loaves over and over again, following that same recipe, what you're doing is you're learning what the dough feels like, what the dough smells like, what the dough looks like, and you're learning the basic fundamentals of the science of fermentation. Now, if you're interested in learning more about this topic, I have two fantastic video series on this. Number one, if you're a beginner, check out my video series, Tartine Bread, Beginner Mistakes and Tips. This was the first video series I made when I was a beginner, and I literally go through every step of this process as a beginner would and explain every step. It's a fantastic resource for beginners. If you're a more experienced baker, I also made a version of that for intermediate bakers called Tartine Bread, Art and Alchemy. And that's where I go through, again, the tartine bread process and recipe, and I make small changes along the way, baking different loaves of bread with minor nuances in the process. It's a fascinating series. Check that one out as well. And I've recently published a new video called The Sourdough Apprentice, where I teach my brother to make sourdough bread for the first time. In this video, I teach him all the steps of the tartine basic country loaf process. It's educational and hilarious. Check that one out as well. So now let's talk about flour. One of the most common mistakes that people make, and I made this when I first started baking, is that I thought all flour was interchangeable. So when I had a recipe that called for 90% bread flour, I dug around in my pantry and I said, oh, I have some spelt, I have some einkorn, I have some emmer, I have some semolina. Flour is flour. You try to use those flours instead of the bread flour that's recommended, and you make a brick. The flours are not interchangeable, particularly for bread flour. Now in the US, we call it bread flour. It's typically 11.5 to 12% or higher protein content in that flour, specifically formulated for bread. In other parts of the world, this might be called strong flour. But here in the US, we make it easy. We put bread in the name. So that sounds easy. This is bread flour. This is bread flour. This is bread flour. This is bread flour. All four of these bags of flour make completely different loaves of bread. So what I recommend is once you master your basic loaf using a single type of bread flour, not substituting different types, then try different bread flours, because you'll get different results. These have different protein levels in them. They're made from different types of wheat. The extraction level is different. They're all bread flours, but all four of these will make a different loaf. So I recommend experimenting with different types of bread flour, because what you'll find is that these make small but noticeable difference in your loaf, and you'll typically fall in love with one of these that just happens to work for you. It works with the type of water that you have in your municipality. It works with the type of loaf that you're making. It works with the whole wheat that you might be blending in with it. So do some experimentation within the realm of bread flour. Try some different varieties. Now, one of the things that you'll find in virtually every sourdough recipe is that it says, start with a strong starter. What does that even mean? If I took a poll of 10 people and said, is your starter stronger than average or weaker than average? Everybody would say it's stronger than average. It's just like Garrison Keillor's Lake Wobegon, where all the men are handsome and all the children are above average. It's impossible for everybody's starter to be stronger than average. Some people have strong starters, some people have weak starters. What I suggest is assume your starter is weak and figure out if you can strengthen your starter, because when you really have a strong starter, it profoundly changes the way that your sourdough bread ferments and bakes up. Now, it took me a while to figure this out. I was pretty far along in my sourdough journey before I really focused on strengthening my starter. And once I did, the results were profound. It was mind-blowing. The way that my loaves fermented and baked up were completely different once I started strengthening my starter before using it for baking. So what is a strong starter? This is the classic example where after a 1-1-1 feeding, your starter should double in volume in roughly 4 to 6 hours. That's a pretty good indication of your starter strength, but it's only focusing on one thing. It's focusing on the yeast. And there's another microbe in here called lactic acid bacteria that also influences the way your loaves bake up. So when I think of a strong starter, I want a starter with a high yeast population and a low lactic acid bacteria population. Because every time you bake a loaf, there's an epic battle going on here in your starter and in your dough, where the yeast is trying to rise the loaf by creating carbon dioxide. The lactic acid bacteria is eating the same foods that the yeast is eating, and as the lactic acid bacteria creates acid, which is its job, it's even in its name, it releases something called the protease enzyme. The protease enzyme is the uninvited party guest in your dough that eats gluten. The protease enzyme gets stimulated when the acidity level rises in your dough. You release the protease enzyme, it eats the gluten, and that's what causes your loaves to deteriorate in overproofing. So when your lactic acid bacteria level is high in your starter or in your dough, it releases the protease enzyme quickly and your loaf will start to break down quickly. If you keep the protease enzyme low in your starter and in your dough, it gives that yeast a long runway to rise the loaf before the protease enzyme starts to deteriorate it. This was one of the most important things that I learned about the fermentation process in the last couple of years. So my recommendation is learn how to strengthen and de-acidify your starter. How do you do that? I have 2 videos on this topic. One is called How to Strengthen a Weak Starter, and I talk about a technique called peak-to-peak feeding. If you basically watch your starter, and as soon as it peaks, discard 80%, do a 1-2-2 feeding, let that peak again, discard 80%, do a 1-2-2 feeding. If you do that 3 or 4 times before you bake, you'll substantially strengthen and de-acidify your starter at the same time. And then periodically, you may want to do a starter strengthening regimen. I demonstrate this in another video called How to Double Your Starter Strength in 6 Days or Less. This was a mind-blowing experiment that I did where I took a very weak starter and over a period of 6 days, only by changing the feeding ratio and the feeding frequency, I more than doubled the strength of that starter. Check out that video as well. Now, as I was improving my baking of sourdough loaves, my loaves were getting a little bit better each time I baked. And what I found was that my crumb still didn't look like the crumb that you see on Instagram or on other people's videos. And I was trying to diagnose what was going wrong. So people were commenting on my videos. I was posting my crumb photos on social media. And people said, "Oh, Tom, nice loaf, but you need to work on your shaping." So I first started doing experiments working on shaping. What was the impact of final shaping? That didn't have much of an impact. Then I said, what's the impact of pre-shaping? That didn't have much of an impact. Then I did an experiment called the impact of bulk fermentation on open crumb, and my life changed. I realized that 80% of the outcome of a sourdough loaf is set up in bulk fermentation. Bulk fermentation makes the bread. If you want to master sourdough baking, you need to master bulk fermentation. That is where everything happens. It's all about perfectly fermenting your dough during bulk fermentation. So I soon became obsessed with this, and I started doing more and more experiments to try to understand how do you determine when bulk fermentation is done. That's one of the most complicated questions for beginning sourdough bakers to answer, even experienced sourdough bakers. Because you can ask an experienced person, how do you know when bulk fermentation is done? And they say, it's easy, just read the dough. What does that mean? I mean, if you ask a violin player, like, how do you play the violin? They don't say, just drag the bow across the strings. If you ask a golfer how to hit a golf ball, they don't say, you just hit the ball in the hole. But in sourdough baking, it's okay for people to say, just read the dough. I don't accept that. That doesn't mean anything. How can you teach somebody by saying just read the dough? So what I did was I've created 8 videos and a tool called the Incredible Bulk-O-Matic System that basically takes 9 observable criteria that experienced bakers use, and I put these on paper and come up with the criteria to determine when bulk fermentation is in that sweet spot. So it looks at the constellation of all these variables, the way that a very experienced baker does this almost intuitively or instinctively. It's sometimes hard for them to even describe what they're doing, but you look at how does the dough smell? How does it feel? What does it look like? Are there bubbles on the top? Is it domed on the top? How long has it been fermenting? What's the dough temperature? It goes through these 9 criteria, and I've taught brand new beginning sourdough bakers how to do this with this tool, and they're baking fantastic loaves on day 1. It's unbelievable. So my recommendation is really develop that skill to determine when is the cutoff for bulk fermentation. Bulk fermentation makes the bread. Now, if you're interested in this topic, which you really must be, this is really not optional, this is required curriculum, check out my series, When is Bulk Fermentation Done? In that series, I do a number of experiments where I hold all the variables constant in bulk fermentation. I change one thing at a time. I change bulk fermentation time. I change the temperature. I change the percent rise. I change the amount of starter. I use a strong starter. I use a weak starter. I use an immature starter. I bake 4 loaves at a time. I cut them open. I do a complete autopsy of the loaf and show exactly what's happening minute by minute, literally, in bulk fermentation. In addition to the videos, I've also created a written guide for the Bulk-O-Matic system, so you can download this and print a copy so you'll have that by your side when you're bulk fermenting your dough in your kitchen. So I participate in a lot of social media groups and I try to help other sourdough bakers, and a lot of times people will post a picture of a bowl of dough sitting on their countertop completely overproofed, and they'll say, I left my dough on the countertop overnight. What happened? And I'll ask, what was your overnight kitchen temperature and what was your overnight dough temperature? And they'll say, I don't know. I don't have a thermometer. I never test my dough temperature. Is that important? Is that important? This is how important it is. Making sourdough bread is basically slow cooking your bread from the time you add the starter to the flour and water. The fermentation process is essentially cooking the loaf at a very low temperature, and fermentation is a temperature-sensitive biological process. If you're not monitoring and managing the temperature of your sourdough, you're at the mercy of your kitchen temperature. You're chained to your countertop. You can't walk away because you have no idea how long your dough should be bulk fermenting or final proofing without knowing the temperature. So temperature is an ingredient. I mean, people say this all the time: flour, water, salt, your sourdough starter, and temperature. It is an ingredient in the process because fermentation is temperature sensitive. If you don't know the temperature, you're not making sourdough. I don't know what you're doing. You're wasting a lot of time and wasting a lot of flour, but you're not making sourdough bread. Now, as I mentioned in the previous segment, if you want to master sourdough baking, you have to master bulk fermentation. If you want to master bulk fermentation, you have to master the interplay of temperature and time. It's as simple as that. So my recommendation is treat temperature as an ingredient, and for God's sake, buy at least one thermometer and take the temperature of your dough. As you may be able to tell, I'm kind of passionate about this topic also. I created a video series called Bulk Fermentation, Mastering Temperature and Time, where I go through the entire process from start to finish, and I measure the temperature of everything. I talk about how to calculate desired dough temperature, different ways to calculate that than the standard one that you might find on the internet. I demonstrate the difference in how the fermentation process works at low temperatures, moderate temperatures, and high temperatures. I analyze the temperature of the dough in the oven while it's baking. I look at the temperature of the loaf when it's cooling on the countertop. It's a complete treatise on temperature and sourdough baking. In addition to that, I made a slightly shorter version in my When is Bulk Fermentation Done video series called Some Like It Hot, where I bulk ferment at 3 different temperatures and talk about the impact of temperature strictly on that segment of bulk fermentation. Check out those videos if you're interested. Have you ever been to a business conference or a convention where the organizers try to get strangers to meet each other through some team building exercise? They break you up into teams and they give you like 3 pieces of newspaper and some drinking straws and tell you you have to create a freestanding giraffe or a box of spaghetti noodles and a bag of marshmallows and tell you to create a windmill. That's essentially what you're doing when you're creating a sourdough loaf. I mean, look at the materials you have to work with. I have water, I have a bowl of dust, I have salt, and I have my sourdough starter. And the challenge here, if you had never done this before, if somebody gave you these ingredients and said you need to create an edifice at least 6 inches or 15 centimeters tall, I would say it's impossible. It can't be done. I mean, look what I'm dealing with here. I mean, this is ridiculous. So as a sourdough baker, you need to understand what is the ingredient in this bowl of magic white dust that lets you create a tall, airy sourdough loaf of bread. The answer is gluten. So what you need to do is understand what I call the gluten structure chain. Let's look at this for a minute. It starts with the flour. You want to have high protein flour, bread flour, as I talked about before, at least 12% protein. That's your starting point. The next thing you do is combine flour and water. That's the chemistry. It takes care of itself. Flour meets water, it creates gluten. Now you get involved, and by handling the dough, by stretching the dough, you're essentially strengthening and aligning those gluten strands. So that's what you're doing when you're mixing and stretching the dough. Then during the bulk fermentation process, you typically do some handling like stretch and folds, coil folds, lamination. What you're doing at that point is creating layers. The layers in the dough, when you stretch and fold and you create those layers, that is what starts to build the architecture of the loaf. That's why the bulk fermentation handling is such a key step in sourdough baking, because we have to build those layers. Then when bulk fermentation is done, I have all those layers of gluten stacked up. Now I do pre-shaping, which creates a few more layers and creates surface tension. Now surface tension you want to think about as if you were Buckminster Fuller creating a geodesic dome. That's essentially what you're doing by the folding and pre-shaping and final shaping and creating that surface tension, is you're trying to get this ball of dough to stand up on its own and create that round loaf. And then in final shaping, we again stack up more layers, create more tension, and create that geodesic dome. This is the architecture portion of the process that I talked about earlier. But in the meantime, while you're building this spectacular gluten edifice, the uninvited party guest from our starter, the protease enzyme that's stimulated by the lactic acid bacteria, starts to eat the gluten. It starts to break down your loaf. It's inevitable. You can't stop it from happening. This is why understanding the fermentation process is important, why having a strong starter is important, because you want the yeast to outrun the lactic acid bacteria so that you can rise the loaf before the protease enzyme deteriorates the loaf. So my recommendation is, for sourdough bakers, understand your role as the architect of the loaf and understand how the gluten structure chain gives you all the materials to work with, but at the same time, the lactic acid bacteria and the protease enzyme are working against you. This is why sourdough baking is completely different than any other type of cooking. There's no other type of cooking where a microorganism is destroying your work. That's what's happening with the protease enzyme and the lactic acid bacteria. If you're interested in this topic, I have 2 video series. One is called the Open Crumb series, where I assessed the impact of final shaping, pre-shaping, and bulk fermentation on the open crumb, particularly that analysis of the bulk fermentation handling methods, stretch and fold, coil fold, lamination, and no handling at all, and what impact that has on the outcome of the loaf is really extraordinary. I have a second video series called Tartine Bread Art and Alchemy, which I've mentioned before, where I go through and actually do small modifications across 4 different loaves so you can see the impact of minor modifications in how I handle the dough during bulk fermentation, how I pre-shape, and how I final shape the loaves. So I continued doing experiments to try to understand the impact of final shaping, pre-shaping, and bulk fermentation on the crumb of my sourdough loaves, and I stumbled down a rabbit hole that I really was not expecting. What I found is that when I was trying to assess the impact, the final shaping and pre-shaping were introducing a lot of variability into the crumb, and I couldn't tell how much of the crumb was from bulk fermentation versus the shaping. So I started to bake loaves with no pre-shaping and no final shaping, and the results were mind-blowing. This is a loaf with no pre-shaping and no final shaping. This is a loaf with no pre-shaping and no final shaping. This is a loaf with no pre-shaping and no final shaping. This is a loaf with no pre-shaping and no final shaping. I literally took bulk fermented dough out of a bowl, flopped it into a shaping basket, put it in the refrigerator overnight. The next morning I scored and baked it, and this is the result that I found. As I said earlier, bulk fermentation makes the bread. I didn't expect it to make that much of the bread. I literally didn't need to shape these loaves because I had such good structure coming out of bulk fermentation that I got huge oven spring, tall loaves, a nice ear. It was really unbelievable. So then I started to evaluate this relationship between your dough strength as it comes out of bulk fermentation, goes into pre-shaping, and goes into final shaping. And what I found is that all 3 of those don't need to be strong. You don't need to have super strong dough coming out of bulk fermentation and do really strong pre-shaping and do really strong final shaping. You can get away with 2 out of 3. So if I have strong dough coming out of bulk fermentation, by strong, I mean I built up a lot of layers during bulk fermentation through coil folding, lamination, stretch and folds, etc. But I have really firm, stiff dough coming out of bulk fermentation. I can skip pre-shaping entirely, do a final shape of the loaf, and then it'll come out perfectly fine. If I have very loose dough coming out of bulk fermentation, where I literally do no handling of the dough, I just mix the dough and let it bulk ferment, that dough is super loose, then I need to do a strong pre-shape and a strong final shape. I went through and figured out all 8 combinations here of bulk fermentation, dough strength, pre-shaping strength, and final shaping strength, and put this chart together. It was a fascinating discovery. So what I found here is that you actually have a lot of options, but you also need to react to the dough based on how it feels in the prior steps. So my recommendation here is to experiment with no shaping, no pre-shaping and no final shaping. Not because I'm recommending that you never do shaping of your loaves, but because it focuses your attention on building that dough structure during bulk fermentation. When you do this challenge and say, I'm not going to pre-shape or final shape the loaf, you become much more attuned and attentive to how much structure you're building during bulk fermentation, because that's all you have. Once you're done with bulk fermentation, you have to bake it. And what you'll find is you'll change your techniques and you'll be more aware of what you're doing in the future. And then when you do shaping of that loaf, it gives you extraordinary height and oven spring because you've really maximized that building of the height during bulk fermentation. It's a little bit like the story of the Greek orator Demosthenes, who would practice public speaking with pebbles in his mouth so that when he actually went to make his speech without the pebbles in his mouth, he spoke even more clearly. What you're doing here is the same thing. You're trying to emphasize that skill of building height and structure in the loaf without the crutch of pre-shaping or final shaping. It will improve your skills dramatically. So if you want to learn more about this topic, check out the videos in my When is Bulk Fermentation Done series. I don't do any pre-shaping or final shaping in those videos. And again, I'm not recommending that you permanently skip that step, but I want you to see what a loaf can look like coming out of bulk fermentation, because I think I'm saying this for the third time now. Bulk fermentation makes the bread. Now, one of the things sourdough bakers struggle with is oven spring. I get this question all the time, where people say they followed all the steps, they bulk fermented perfectly, they did the shaping just like the videos, but they're not getting oven spring, they're not getting that explosive bloom on the loaf, they're not getting the ear, and they're trying to figure out what's going wrong. It's very complicated because oven spring is the accumulation of all the prior steps before the loaf goes in the oven. That's the conventional wisdom. But what I've also found is that oven spring is significantly influenced by what happens in the oven. Now you need two things in the oven to get great oven spring. You need steam and you need the proper amount of heat on the loaf during that first 20 minutes while it's baking. And this is really where I stumbled on a fascinating discovery. Now the way that I bake my loaves is in a Dutch oven in the oven. I preheat the Dutch ovens with the lid on the side like this so it heats the inside at 500 degrees Fahrenheit or 260 degrees Celsius. Once it gets up to that temperature, I put the loaf in the oven, I put the lid on, I put it back in the oven, and I immediately reduce the temperature to 450 degrees Fahrenheit or 230 degrees Celsius. It's basically the exact process recommended by Chad Robertson in the Tartine book, and a lot of recipes follow this. What I found was if I made 3 identical loaves and baked them in these 3 Dutch ovens in the same oven, heated up to the same temperature, this is a 7-quart or 7-liter Dutch oven, 6-quart or 6-liter, 5-quart or 5-liter. What I find is that in my oven and in my Dutch ovens, I get better oven spring in the big Dutch oven. And I was getting poor oven spring in the small Dutch oven, and I was getting pretty good oven spring in the medium Dutch oven. So I started to ask myself the question, how and why is this possible? Here's what happens. When you put a loaf into a small Dutch oven where it's really cramped in that Dutch oven and it doesn't have any elbow room or breathing room around it, the radiant heat from the outside of the Dutch oven heats up the crust too quickly. So it's basically cooking the crust faster in this Dutch oven than in this one because the sides of the Dutch oven are closer to the crust. So it impedes the oven spring. It sets up the crust too quickly. So even though that loaf was exactly the same and it had all the potential to spring, the crust set up too fast. In this Dutch oven, the same size loaf has airspace around it. So I'm not getting the radiant heat from the sides of the Dutch oven pounding that heat right down on the edges of that loaf. Just that little bit of airspace difference between this one and this one allows convection air, basically the air inside the Dutch oven, to move around, and that radiant heat doesn't set up the crust as quickly, and it allows this one to spring more to its full potential. Now, you might ask the question, wow, is there really that much difference between the size of this Dutch oven and the size of this Dutch oven? I'll ask you to do a test. The next time you heat up your Dutch oven, do this very carefully. Hold your hand right next to this Dutch oven and feel how much hotter it is than if you move it 2 inches away from the Dutch oven. It's significantly different because the radiant heat coming off of that cast iron pumps that heat right into the crumb, into the crust in the small Dutch oven. It gives it a little breathing room in the large Dutch oven. So when you're in this small Dutch oven, this is like being in economy class on the plane. Your loaf has nowhere to go. It's crammed in here with no elbow room, with all that heat pounding down on it. Upgrade your loaf to first class. Put it in a bigger Dutch oven, give it a little breathing room, and in my experience, that really allows it to open up. Now, I haven't done an experiment on this one yet, but it's the next one on the docket as soon as I finish this video. So in a very short time, I'll have a video out there experimenting with different baking temperatures during the first 20 minutes and the impact of different sized Dutch ovens. One of the things I do when I'm not baking sourdough bread is I spend a lot of time on social media looking at photos of other people's sourdough bread. You know how this goes. People take a photo, they cut the loaf open, they post the crumb photo and say, is this overproofed or underproofed? I've probably looked at 1,000 loaves online and rendered an opinion on what's going on with that loaf based on the crumb. I don't know if I'm the best crumb reader in the business, but I'm one of the most experienced. Every crumb tells a story. It's unbelievable how much you can tell about the process that went into making the loaf just by reading the crumb. Now this takes some time to develop this skill, but I can look at a picture of a crumb and tell what type of flour they used, what the hydration level was, what type of handling they did, whether the bulk fermentation was too long, too short, whether they have an acidic starter, whether they don't. I mean, it's endless how much information you can glean out of just looking at that crumb photo. It really, really tells the story of the loaf like nothing else. So my recommendation is to develop the skill to learn how to read a sourdough crumb. This is an essential skill as a sourdough baker, so that after each bake, you can cut your loaf open, look at the crumb, and assess what you could have done differently if you're trying to continuously improve your baking. In addition to looking at the crumb, I also recommend keeping notes. I use a very detailed worksheet that goes through all the steps of all of my bakes. Then I also take a photo of each one of my loaves, so I have my documentation of what I did, and I have the picture of the crumb, and the combination of those two things tells the story of the loaf. I'm a firm believer that you can dramatically improve the quality of your baking by really assessing and understanding what's happening after each bake. So I recommend developing this skill. Now luckily, I've just created a new video and have created a tool called How to Read a Sourdough Crumb. I recommend checking out that video and downloading the tool, so then you have a handy printout in your kitchen, so when you cut your loaf open and say, this doesn't look like the picture I saw on Instagram, what went wrong? You can pretty quickly diagnose what happened with your loaf. And lastly, thank you for sticking with me. The perfect loaf remains elusive. In all the baking that I've done, I've never looked at a loaf and said, wow, that's perfect. And I don't know if I ever will, but I know that I'm continuously improving my baking. And the way that I do this is by focusing on the science. The science gives you the foundation or the baseline to create your loaf so that you then have the ability to apply the art on top of that. This is very much like when Michelangelo carved the statue of David. He said the statue was always in there. All he had to do was clear away the stone. The science is clearing away the stone so that you can get to the art. That's that last 10% or less of sourdough baking that really lets you express yourself, but you have to have the basics, the foundation to be able to get to that. The great thing about sourdough baking is that every loaf is a lesson, every mistake is edible, and the flour is pretty darn cheap. Thanks for watching my video. Good luck on your sourdough journey.